Okay, so hello everyone, dear participants and all of you who will be watching this video. Greetings, and I'm Somava Basu, President and Founder of the Council for Global Cooperation, CGC, and I would like to warmly welcome you all to our today's session. Our today's session is a book discussion focusing on a new title, The Project State and Its Rivals, A New History of the 20th and 21st Centuries by Charles Maier. This book was published in May 2023 by Harvard University Press. Drawing from his decade of research, Professor Maier in his book invites a rethinking of the long 20th century. The project State and Its Rivals deals with the history of state entanglement with capital, the decline of public projects, and the fragility of governance, explaining the fraying of our own civic culture, but also allowing hope for its recovery. It is one of the must-read modern treatises on the 20th and 21st century state, following another masterpiece of his that came out by Professor Maier a few years ago, Leviathan 2.0. Before we start with our today's event, for our viewers, I would like to briefly introduce the author and our today's featured speaker, Professor Charles Maier. So, Professor Charles Maier is the Leverett Saltstall Research Professor of History at Harvard University and the Chief Advisor to our CGC. Professor Maier is a leading historian and political theorist whose research focuses on international history, European studies, history of political thought, and political philosophy. At Harvard, he served as the director of the Minder D. Gunsberg Center for European Studies from 1994 to 2001, and currently co-directs the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History. He taught at Harvard as instructor, assistant professor, and lecturer from 1967 to 75, and was a visiting professor of history at the University of Bielefeld in the German Federal Republic in spring 1976, and then served as associate professor and professor of history at Duke University. And finally, he returned to Harvard as professor of history. He was the Krupp Foundation Professor of European Studies, and then as the first Leverett Saltstall Professor of History until his retirement from Harvard in June 2019. Professor Maier had the opportunity to serve various appointments across and held distinguished fellowships. His publications include several numerous scholarly articles and books. His award-winning publications include, some of them include Once Within Borders, Territories of Power, Wealth, and Belonging since 1500, Among Empires, American Ascendancy and its Predecessors, Leviathan 2.0, Inventing Modern Statehood, and Once Within Borders, Territories of Power, Wealth, and Belonging since 1500. For his meritorious scholarship and outstanding research contributions, he has been awarded the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany and the Cross of Honor for Science and Art by the Republic of Austria. It is a great honor and joy to have you with us for your book, Professor Maier, along with our three other scholar panelists, Professors Sidney Tarot, Harold James, and Peter Hall, whom I would be introducing a little later in the session today. So now, without further delays, I would like to pass on the floor to you, Professor Maier, for your opening remarks and giving a brief overview of your book. The Zoom room is yours, Professor.
Thank you, Suvama. You are a true historical entrepreneur, and you've recruited some leading people. Listening to this is like Tom Sawyer listening to his funeral eulogy. I'm always sort of embarrassed by them. I hope this. I can't tell from my screen how many of your fellow students are involved, but it's very encouraging to find so much interest in European history and Western history in India. I really doubt we could muster the same reciprocal attention at this point, which is unfortunate. Look, I don't know how long to speak. You've suggested 20 minutes. I don't think I'd rather hear from other people and get a discussion going. What I wanted to do in this book, well, first of all, this book was written with an eye toward mortality. I was in my 80s. I didn't know how many large books significant books I could produce. At that age, I wanted to do one major narrative. In a sense, it fulfilled a promise that people have been asking me after my first book, which is now 48 years ago, Recasting Bourgeois Europe, when there would be a sequel. I thought of doing a post-World War II sequel, but the years went on, and a vast amount of researchers were tackling it. So I decided to do a more synthetic work. But what struck me as well was the difference between the elation of people in the West, at least, sometimes called triumphalism, about the events of 1989 to 1994, the collapse of the Soviet empire, the end of really single-party communist governments in Europe, not in China, Vietnam, or Cuba, but in Europe during that period, the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa. And so obviously in the 90s, this was seen as a rather glorious moment, the end of history, to cite one notorious title and text. And yet by the early 2000s, we were deep into an economic crisis, the worst since the Great Depression. We had suffered the rise of terrorism in the 1970s through, and then its revival in a different form in 2001, etc. Cast our present moment at that time into a whole different light. And what I wanted to do was try and write a history that could accommodate, I won't say explain, accommodate both this feeling of great events, great emancipation from the 1990s, and this moment of much deeper pessimism in the 2010s. Also, the rise of populism, the rise of authoritarianism, different regimes, competitive authoritarianism perhaps, but still nasty politics. We could sometimes call it populism. And how might we fit both these phenomena into one explanatory, one narrative? And that was the intellectual challenge. I also wanted to get away from what in the United States, I think, in the English-speaking world is a usually explanatory division between good guys and bad guys, authoritarians and Democrats, which I do believe, if you look back, is the major structuring framework we've had for our contemporary histories. And so I wanted to try and get beyond that or around that. So find a new perspective, take account of two different public moods, and put together a fairly long-term history. This, in some sense, required my doing something different than the work you cited about Once Within Borders. And there was an article in the year 2000, which the historians would know, in the AHR, consigning the 20th century to history. In these works, my explanatory model had been the rise of sort of a territorial obsession from the 1850s, 1860s, which I thought lasted through the 1970s, really. And so this new history I was undertaking had to be at least had to make sense within that earlier framework, or had to take account of that earlier framework. periodization is the historian's mug game. It's really necessary, and it's always tricky because it's very subjective, and essentially it's a statement about what's important in the events of a period. This was an awkward periodization, but anyway, I wanted to bring it up to date as best I could. So that was my starting point. And what I was struck by was the decline of what the title is, project states. That is, ambitious governments, states that had ambitious agendas of social and political change, that wanted to change society and not just hang on to power. And these are, they're not rare phenomenon, but they're not everyday phenomenon, and they're phenomenon. The project state, as I envisaged it, was not a good guy, bad guy type of division. It was we had project states that I admired: the New Deal, the Labor government of 1945, perhaps the French Popular Front, the Great Society before it went off track in Vietnam, and we had project states that were ghastly, such as the Third Reich, Stalinist Russia, etc. So the project state cut across that line, and however, it was not, and it's not structured as the only agent of historical change or progress or discontinuity within the period. So as I was thinking about it, the young historians I was reading, those not so young, had really changed their focus from authoritarianism versus democracy. Many of them, the historians, at least on the left, the historians who passed through our seminar on capitalism in the state at the Harvard Center and elsewhere, were really preoccupied with capitalism, markets, labor, things related to the economy. So the capitalist world, or the world of economic agents, especially those who were investors, bankers, and increasingly there was financial capital that was seemed to be setting the tune for capital entrepreneurship in general. The what I call the web of capital, because it is structured around networks more than nationally, or increasingly structured around networks rather than just national units, was clearly one of the other agents. And then reading the international history literature, international historians were celebrating or discovering, stressing the role of NGOs, non-state actors, whether they were agreed on by treaty, such as the UN, the ILO, the League of Nations earlier, or just actors we think of as foundations, such as Rockefeller and Ford Foundation. These were playing a role that our frameworks of history had not taken, I thought, adequate account of. And I describe these as the realm of governance. And I use governance in a particular way, which is, I try and I'll set this out in the first chapter of the book. Governance to me is a type of claim to scientific knowledge or expertise. It's usually decided on by discussions among would-be so-called experts. It's a claim of knowledge, and but it is not a claim to political power. The realm of governance works by trying to persuade those who hold political power, those in the state, on policies to make. And so what I wanted to do is, and I tried to do in this book, is sort of have a braid of historical actors: the state, the web of capital, and the spokespeople, the exponents of governance, and in the sense of both NGOs, agreed on international organizations, foundations, all the sorts of expertise that now come in to try and make a claim to steer steer our society. And so my history is essentially of taking these strands and weaving them, and some are dominant at some point. The project state was largely created or boosted by, in the First World War, the need for government to intervene so heavily, but it also emerged from the end of the century revolutions, which the ones that, Mexico, China, Persia, revolutions across much of the world, often in an anti-colonial sense. This was also an impetus for the project state. In any case, the project state, as I conceived it, although there are always project states, had been given a new thrust between the 1890s and the end of World War I. But if you looked at by the time you looked at the late 20s, I thought the project state was running out of steam. The spokespeople and the directors of capital were much more powerful. Then in the Depression, the state stepped in again. In World War II and its aftermath, the state set in again, only to lose ground in the 1950s. I think when you could say to forces or agents of capital, governance is there as a sort of leitmotif throughout, because what I think characterizes our recent decades is that the networks of governance have sought an accommodation. In fact, well, they often rest upon have accumulations of capital like the great foundations, but they've sought an accommodation with capital and the state. So it's a complicated narrative. I won't go through the narrative, but the book is structured around what I think are the decisive phases in that narrative. And it ends on no, it doesn't end with a great finale, and it's not like a wonderful 19th century symphony with these wonderful resolutions of chords, because I don't know where it's ending. We feel, I think, in the United States, we still don't know which forces are likely to prevail, and the book has been critiqued on that grounds, that it sort of fades out rather than brings to a conclusion. But I think this is an open history, and I think most histories are open, and that's where I've left it. So I would hope that the book serves as a way of rethinking the 20th century or the last 100 years in particular, up to the present. And I think this is a good place to perhaps start a discussion. We could talk about turning points. Eric Hobsbawm left us with a short 20th century, which was sort of a sandwich of unhappy events between up to 1914 and then and 1989. Many historians have been preoccupied by fascism as the decisive element in the 20th century. Tony Judd's wonderful book, Post-War, is really a book about almost historical memory of fascism and getting beyond it. I don't like to reduce the current tendencies, authoritarian tendencies, to fascism. I like to keep terms relatively pure and isolated, but the turning points in this story, therefore, are not 1918 or 1914, 1949, 45. I mean, the real turning point, I think, for the current era is, and in this I sympathize with many political scientists, I think, and younger historians, are the 1970s. And I think the decisive political cause for the change, to the era of, let's call it neoliberalism, to use which may be passing, but to use a common phrase, has been the defection of the traditional social democratic or left center political current, from being defenders of a project state to being to losing faith in it in the 1970s. And so the balance of ideological commitments, I believe, changed fairly decisively at that point. And Peter Hall can speak to this, perhaps, certainly. And that defection, in a sense, is the story in my later chapters. Another factor I should mention is the role of money creation or debt. Harold James's work was important to me here. His discussion of the Basel Committee. The 20th century was built on monetizing claims to the future. This was the great discovery of financial capital, is how you can take expectations about the future and sell them in the present, mobilize a current labor power, investment power by thoughts about the future. And in some sense, this meant an inflationary bias to the 20th century, and that too has been part of the underpinning of the oscillations for the project state. So today, I think, where are we? Well, as a historian, I don't have to predict the future. Everybody wants to know it, but I do think that this is a complex set of interweaving actors, regimes, underlying conditions. The end of empire, of course, has a great role in this story, although in my second chapter, I try and show that the legacies of empire, which were financial and economic, played a role in structuring the inequalities, global inequalities we see today. And anyway, I think it's books are like children, they have a life of their own. No one can make sure that they're going to follow the prescribed path, and I will be interested I have time to see it, as to how this particular child makes its way in the world. So thank you for your reading and for your attention and for your participation. It's sort of intriguing that such a great panel has been summoned by a young Indian historian, and I'm grateful to him and to all of you. So I'll leave it at that for
now. Thank you so much, Professor Maier, for providing a brief overview of your excellent work and highlighting your stimulating research. So it was as you have opened up a lot to discuss about, and we would definitely take it up during the discussion period. But for now, I would like to go to our first panelist. We would like to go to our panelists, and our first panelist in order is Professor Harold James. I would like to briefly introduce Professor James. Professor Harold James is the Claude and Lore Kelly Professor in European Studies at Princeton University and is Professor of History and International Affairs at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. He is a leading economic historian specializing in the history of Germany and European economic history. He has extensively written on the economic implications of globalization and global economic crisis. Some of his prominent and extraordinary publications include Reichsbank and Public Finance in Germany, 1924 to 1933, Nazi Dictatorship and the Deutsche Bank, Krupp, A History of the Legendary German Firm, Europe Contested from the Kaiser to Brexit, and his most recent work, 7 Crashes, the Economic Crisis That Shaped Globalization. He is the winner of the Helmut Schmidt Prize for Economic History and the Ludwig Erhard Prize for Writing About Economics. He is the official historian of the International Monetary Fund. It's a great privilege to have you with us, Professor James. I look forward to your commentary.
Well, thank you so much, Sumavar. It's really great being with you, and it's wonderful to discuss this very, very important and interesting, stimulating book by Charles Maier, which I just learned such a lot from. And to start with, I thought the framing of the narrative in terms of these four pillars, and you're careful, Charlie, to say it's not, they're not ideal types, they're not Weberian ideal types, but they represent something that I think is really central to an analytical story of the 20th century: the project state, the resource empire, the web of capital and governance. And you deal really masterfully. It's like a loom where you weave the thread between these different ways of thinking about the way in which people are associated, and communities and states are associated in an international order or in an international disorder. And you mentioned when you talked about the overview, the question of periodization. And that to me is the most obvious issue. And I think maybe my colleagues will be interested in taking this up as well, because I think it's not very often that a really epochal event takes place. And when it takes place just at the moment that you're concluding writing an important manuscript and preparing it for the press and launching it into the public, I wonder how much this affects your story. So for me, the world has fundamentally changed since the 24th of February last year. And in some ways, it seems to me that this is also a moment in which when you referred to ways of thinking about when the 20th century ends, does it end in 1989, or does it end in 2001 with the terrorist attacks, or does it end with the global financial crisis, or does it end with Donald Trump and Brexit? I think the last story of the intensification of Russia's attack on Ukraine, after all, it didn't start last year, but it reached a dramatic height. And so this is, I think, a story that, for me, is best summed up as a story about imperialism and the end of imperialism, and it's the end of empire. It's the end of a resources empire. So it fits nicely into your concept, but it modifies the story a bit, I think, because first of all, it's a story of decolonization that goes on for longer than we conventionally think about it. In one of the early chapters, you talk about the Portuguese and Spanish empires and how they were the creakiest and most neglected colonial possessions, but that they lasted longest. Well, I think the Russian Empire really can be put into that category. And I think some people at the time saw that. Charles de Gaulle had a really fascinating remark that he said that the fortunate thing that enabled France and Spain to deal with their colonies and their story of decolonization, and after all, it was de Gaulle who really managed this process in the end of French rule in Algeria. De Gaulle said France and Spain were fortunate in that their colonial territories, Morocco or Algeria, were separated by water from the homeland. And that's basically the case with all the Western colonial powers, Belgium, the Netherlands, Britain. There's an exception, I would think, in the story of Ireland and the role of Ireland in the British Empire. But that also is a story that is much, much more painful than most of the British story of decolonization, and longer drawn out. So how do we think about what's happening. And that's also, I think, part of the story of the continuation of the territorial state. To take up one of your earlier themes, and you emphasized how this comes in the middle of the 19th century as a big driving idea. But it's really crucial as well to the way in which Mr. Putin thought about the historic unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And that goes back in some measure to the story of the conversion of Rus and the baptism of St. Vladimir if you're Russian, or St. Volodymyr if you're Ukrainian. But this is about territory, and it's a kind of conflict that we thought had largely been eclipsed in the course of the extension of the age of capital and the web of capital and the rise of global governance. So this is something new. The second point I wanted to ask you about, and it's in a way related to that, is that I think nationalism gets a little bit underplayed in your book, and the importance of nationalism in the populist story seems to me to be very evident. I mean, it's obviously part of the Russian story, but it's part of the Hungarian story, it's part of the Polish story, it's part of the Indian story. You know, we had this G20 summit last week, and people were wondering about the invitations to the dinner that invited you not to something organized by India, but by Bharat. So nationalism is really still everywhere, and it's really at the heart of this. And this was one of the things that I think many people, I was part of that as well, thought was going to be swept away by these cross-border connections. But in fact, the age of nationalism is back with a vengeance, and it seems to me that one way of redescribing the age of populism is to describe it as the age of a terrifying and really quite violent nationalism. So those are my two main thoughts about where I love the book, but where I thought also that you have some of the implements to give a slightly different analysis of it. And that's the wonderful thing about a great book. It provokes exactly that kind of thought. And thanks.
Thank you, Harold.
Yes, Professor Maier, would you like to respond or provide?
Right. Well, okay. Unless you want to collect everybody's comments, why don't I just briefly respond, because I don't want to, I want other people to have a chance, and then we can return in the general discussion. I mean, I think I obviously didn't take account of the Ukrainian attack, although I could have looked at 2014 in Crimea and not just last February 24th. Yes, in some sense, I guess I guess I'm a little like Schumpeter. In some sense, any type of imperialism seems a little bit archaic to me. I mean, landed territorial imperialism, and the purpose of the resource empire was to show that you could continue a dominating or hegemonic, whatever you want to call it, exploitative relationship without having to hold on to territory, which seemed to be the story of the resource empire. But Harold, you may be right. I'm not willing yet to put the Ukrainian war and I do say at the beginning there was a Russian effort to reconstitute an empire, but the difference between empire and nation, as you know, are always sort of muddy categories. They run together in the story of Russian history since the late 17th century. Is this have I underplayed nationalism? Yes, in an explicit sense, but I think try and I guess I would, if would suggest that I really think of it as as you mentioned, a component of populism. As I said, the populism sees two ethnic, two components to a nation. One is its sort of virtuous, pure core, and the other are all these exploitative and parasitic elements that seep in from abroad or within. And I guess I was subsuming nationalism under that. I don't know. Again, we don't know. A lot will depend upon how things turn out. I mean, it is conceivable that we all wish, I think, that somehow some Russian armies would do what they did in the spring of 1917 and just sort of refuse to fight, or that at home the cosmopolitan forces would force change upon Putin. I'm unwilling to commit to how this is historically to be ordered or woven into a chronicle yet, but but yeah, I can see how you think that anyone could say this in a sense. Every time, Maier, you're just you're not emphasizing enough the continuing force of nationalism, these non-governance, non-capital impulses or motivations that overtake countries and dictatorships. So if I'm around to write an updated conclusion in a few years, I'll be better able to address the question. And thank you for your attentiveness and generous comments.
Thank you so much, sir, for the reflections. So now we would like to go to a second panelist in order, and that is Professor Sidney Tarrow. Professor Sidney Tarrow is the Emeritus Maxwell Upson Professor of Government at Cornell University, and Adjunct Professor at Cornell Law School. He's a historian and specialist in European politics and society, and has written widely on Italian and French politics, center-periphery relations, new social movements, and contentious politics. He is a leading expert on new social movements and, more broadly, the phenomena of contentious behavior. He is the author of several articles, monographs, and edited volumes. Among his numerous award-winning books, I would like to mention a few: Peasant Communism in Southern Italy, the New Transnational Activism, and his most recent, Movements and Parties, Critical Connections in American Political Development. It's a great privilege to have you with us today, Professor Tarrow. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sumova. Thanks very much. And thanks to Charlie for providing us with this peak career book, in my view. It is a remarkable document, which, like a lot of other of Charlie's books, combines historical synthesis with almost microscopic analysis of individual cases. This book, though it's much broader in scope than Recasting Bourgeois Europe, which is the book of his I know best, relates like a father and grandson to his first book. As Charlie remarks, his tongue deeply inside his cheek, perhaps like an old dog I have dug up and gnawed on bones that I forgot I had buried. Well, from the look of this book, written in his mid-80s, the old dog hasn't forgotten much. The Project State centers on two of Charlie's old friends, the state and capitalism. And I'm glad he reminded us of the State and Capitalism seminar, which he and I met at CES in the 1970s and 80s. But to this duality, he's added two new protagonists, what he calls the resource empire and the realm of community and governance. These four agents are not only protagonists, he writes, but together they carry the weight of a lot of history. What's more ambivalent in the book is his analyses of the varied and often contributions of this concept of the realm of governance. Having spent the early years of this century studying transnational associations and institutions, I would hesitate to designate this range of actors as either a realm or a community in any meaningful sense. In the late 1990s, optimistic scholars saw transnational governance as the source of liberal values, thinking of Margaret Keck and Catherine Sickink's work. But in the early 21st century, as illiberal movements began to diffuse across the globe, observers were less confident of the beneficent influence of transnational institutions and associations. And I think that's something that is missing from the book. Before complaining about what Charlie's left out, let me pause for a moment to comment on what he's achieved. The four protagonists worked most creatively together in what he calls the US-led Bretton Woods order, when, in his words, each of the collective actors, project state, resource empire, realm of governance, and web of capital, could hardly subsist on their own. They were discernible, I'm still quoting, discernible forces contending for power, norms, and wealth, but not independently effective. And I think this is the foundation for what Charlie correctly, in my view, describes as the critical decade of the 1970s, when all of this synthesis comes apart. At a certain point, he argues, this nicely balanced quartet falls apart. States and civil societies become virtually fused. States and interstate umbrellas intersect. The relation of resource empires to project states dampens, his term, and the network of capital becomes so global that it's eventually detached from its close partnership with the project state. So there's a dynamism in the story which centers on the collapse of the synthesis of the Bretton Woods period. What strikes me as most important about the book is not any of the four protagonists, but their interactions, and particularly their interactions through something that appears throughout the book without being given a status like the other four, and it's the realm of contentious politics. And that includes, of course, nationalist movements, which Professor James properly pointed to. Let me illustrate my argument with material from the project state and its rivals. My problem is that contentious politics appears at many instances within the book without being assigned a distinct role. After the relative quiescence of the post-war decades, contentious politics returns to the scene in what Aristide Zolberg called a moment of madness, and which Alessandro Pizzorno less apocalyptically called a cycle of protest. Enthusiasts for what the French remember as May 68 were convinced that it was a moment of liberation. But the moment was more complicated and more widely diffused. First, what began in France in May 68 had important predecessors in Italy, Germany, and of course the United States. Secondly, the French 68 was rapidly reversed by the deflationary economic policy that followed. And here is a relationship between contentious politics and the project state that I think could have been more deeply investigated. Indeed, in many of the countries that he studies, there is a distinct and proportional counter-movement to the 1960s, which put conservative governments back in the saddle for much of the 1970s. But in the meantime, as Charlie insists, the redistributive thrust of the 1960s project led to a powerful wave of inflation that would discredit reform coalitions, unquote. That wave had other sources like the Johnson-Nixon wartime spending splurge and the two OPEC oil price hikes, but the 1960s cycle of contention and the reformist response to it was the beginning of a movement counter-movement dynamic, leading to what Charlie describes as, quote, a reorganization of political constituencies, a reassertion of religious authority, a revision of economic ideas and theories, and in some places, military takeovers. So the political and economic movements, which I'm summarizing with the term contentious politics, comprised, quote, a profound multi-decade cycle of reform and stabilization and of anticipation for a global left and then disappointment. Charlie writes that the shift to neoliberalism, which began to roll back welfare capitalism, was an outcome of the reaction to the reformism of the 60s. For this connection, he offers a lot of good evidence, but I wonder if he doesn't elide a key contribution. That is, the connection between changes in the Western political economy and the decline, and then the implosion of the Soviet Empire and the impact it had on Western political economies. I won't try and go into any detail about this, but simply remind you that welfare capitalism was not simply a domestic development, but was the response in policy terms to the challenge of the Soviet Union and its supposed model of economic and social inequality. The West's response to the challenge of state socialism and its promise of social and economic inequality was a very important contributing factor to the welfare capitalism of the immediate post-war period. With the decline of state socialism, that incentive was no more. Charlie highlights Thatcher and Reagan, but there were many other leaders who engaged in what my colleague Ken Roberts calls bait and switch strategies, coming into office with progressive programs and then adopting neoliberal policies in government after running for office on progressive terms. So here's my suggested addendum to Charlie's argument. In the post-war decades, the state socialist threat, which decision makers had neatly compartmentalized into a bucket called foreign policy, actually imposed on them the need to offer an internal bargain between capital and labor, one that was guided either directly or indirectly by the project state. Well, this tripartite system was most openly practiced in what came to be called the smaller European democracies. The threat of communism, as long as it lasted, was the external source for the adoption of class-compromising welfare capitalism. As that challenge went away, the way was open for the neoliberal period that we are now looking back on in the second decade of the 21st century. And that's my few criticisms, which are really drew from what I learned from this book, from this tremendous peak career product by Charles Maier. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you, Sid. Gee, peak career. It's always a little scary. Anyway, at least late career. Let me pick up on this last point if I can, because this is where I tried to offer something that was different. And I don't dispute what you're saying. Obviously, what I had a different take, which I put in the book, on the impact of the competitive impact of state socialism. And that is that it, in fact, as long as it was out there, it suggested there was an alternative, not one that worked very well, but that there was an alternative for managing a modern political economy, which did not involve the realm of capital, and that that in some sense it wasn't an adversary. It was an adversary too, but it was also it was a rival in the sense that, hey, this is a possibility that that could be. We don't like the way it works, but that it has existed, and that once it went, it didn't remove. It removed a sort of type of potential political possibility. I don't want to use the word utopianism, but alternative. And when it defected, when it collapsed, there was no alternative. Capitalism was the only political economic game in town. This is different from, and I can't measure them together. It is the way I tried to deal with the end of state socialism. So others can weigh in on this and decide whether it's a persuasive argument or not. The one you've offered is certainly there. Contentious politics. Yeah, I guess I think of contentious politics as part of the noise the machine is always making. Machiavelli has a wonderful line in his History of Florence, which says, people who look at all the party conflicts, the partisanship, are thinking, we have to understand this is the smoke that the fire of liberty produces. And I've always liked that. So I guess I take contentious politics. It's a different sort of contention. If it's acted out in the streets, it's different than if it's ritualized in electoral politics. There isn't much about politics in your sense as a type of ongoing dialogue or dispute or means, as the ongoing mechanism of the machines of state, and I can see where you miss that. I'm not sure. The role of the state socialism and its defection, I think, it's a big one, and I would just say, I'll think about yours. I mean, we've all thought about it in many ways, and I may have gone a bridge too far in saying this was in some sense a sense of alternative that actually had a role which was not just that of being not just being that of the specter that's haunting Europe or the West, but of the specter that's saying, hey, things might be different. It's possible. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. Harold.
Thanks again. It was a wonderful book and wonderful discussion. And I'm sorry to miss
you
more.
You have to go, I know. Anyway, it's great of you to tune in from Vietnam, isn't it?
Vietnam.
Thanks, Harold, for all.
Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. Yes, so I think, so should we go for our other panelists, or would you like to add something on the points Professor Taro made?
I'm fine.
Okay. Yeah, so now we would like to go to our final panelist, Professor Peter Hall. Professor Peter Hall is Krupp Foundation Professor of European Studies in the Department of Government at Harvard University. He is a scholar who focuses his research mostly on the developments in the OECD political economies, the role of ideas and institutions in politics, methods of political science, European politics, and issues of social inequality. He has written numerous articles and books on comparative politics, political economy, and social policy. Some of his books include Varieties of Capitalism, The Institutional Foundations of Comparative Advantage, edited with David Soskis, Social Resilience in the Neoliberal Era, edited with Michael Lamont, and The Politics of Representation in the Global Age, Identification, Mobilization, and Adjudication, edited with Wade Jacoby, Jonah Levy, and Sophie Munir. It is a great privilege to have you with us, Professor Hall, and I pass on the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Basu. I hope you can hear me. I'm living in a kind of construction zone here, and so the noise, I have a kind of background symphony to my remarks. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about this book with a group of old friends. I put the emphasis on friends rather than old, and just in case no one has seen it yet, there's the book, right? I don't know, it doesn't look like it looks like you can't see it very well because of my background, but anyway, there it is. This is a very impressive book. I mean, the range of reference to historical events, but not just historical events, also to the arguments found in other disciplines, I think is nothing, excuse me, short of amazing. There are really flashes of great brilliance sprinkled throughout this text. Aristotle wrote that the highest form of thinking was metaphor, and Charlie's capacity to evoke meaning through metaphor is really quite spectacular. So I agree with my fellow panelists. This work is a truly appropriate capstone to a distinguished career. Although I am waiting for that postscript, Charlie, after you've heard our comments and observed the next year or two of world developments. In larger terms, in more substantive terms, I suppose, I also think that the book amply justifies the architectonic decision of its author to reinterpret the history of the long 20th century through the prism of what is called the project state. And I kept asking myself, well, are we not losing something here by moving beyond what Charlie calls the moral narratives that interpret this 20th century history as a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism? And I think that something is lost, but I also think that much more is gained from this new perspective. There are issues raised by the perspective. I found the ones that have been raised so far extremely interesting and well worth pondering, and in some ways testimony to how stimulating the book is. I have three issues that I want to raise to see partly what Charles Maier has to say about them and to see if it stimulates further discussion. So to begin with the most central, on my reading, and I think this sounds correct based on what others have said, the book associates the developments of the 1980s and 1990s, the so-called neoliberal age, with the decline of the project state, at least in the West. So Charlie interprets what I would call the move to the market of those decades with the loss of ambition that signals the end of a project state. And there's certainly some justification for this. There's no question about that. Many governments turned over to markets responsibilities that had previously been seen as central functions of the state. I mean, I think one of the developments of that era that's not remarked upon enough by my fellow political scientists is the way in which public services were no longer seen as something that states had to provide, no longer seen as public goods, and instead, in a sense, states that had once served citizens in the extreme cases, maybe New Zealand and Britain, for instance, but elsewhere too, saw themselves as deliverers of services to consumers rather than the representatives of citizens. And so efficiency became more important than issues like access and equity. So I think something really happened there. But in the case of Britain in particular, under that conviction politician, Margaret Thatcher, seems to me that she led the British state, and I see that Jay Winder is here. He may have different views about this. She led the British state in ways that seemed to me to have a very clear-cut project, a project aimed at transforming society as well as governance. You know, Gorbachev may have said that Mrs. Thatcher was someone he could do business with, but this was not business as usual. And I think the British state of the 1980s and early 1990s could be described in that respect, at least, as a project state. Andrew Gamble made this point really during the Thatcher years itself with his book about the strong state in the free society. And Polanyi made this argument many years ago, the notion that markets or institutions, in order to create something that we might call free markets, actually requires enormously active and interventionist state endeavor. So in some cases, at least, it's not clear to me, and I had to come up with some provocative points, and that's why I'm coming up with this one. There are ways in which the most forceful expressions of neoliberalism in the 1980s and 90s reflect, or could be said to reflect, the actions of a project state. And of course, the same can't be said for many European countries. A lot of them just muddled through those decades. But it's arguable, for instance, that under President François Mitterrand, both before and after 1983, France pursued an equally transformative, or the French state at least tried to pursue an equally transformative set of projects. Initially, something that you could think of as Keynesianism in one country. Subsequently, after 1983, what I would call and have called modernization from below, where the driver was an effort to force French business to compete in a new open European single market under the handicap of the franc for a high exchange rate. And so there are ways in which we could interpret the neoliberal period of the 80s and 90s as the reflection of actions of a project state. So, to put this very provocatively, it's not only fascists and social democrats who have projects and use their states to pursue them. And intense market competition, as I think we've all now learned, is itself often a force for social transformation. So that would be my first point, and I'd be interested to see how far Charlie thinks one can carry that, if indeed he does it all. Secondly, although I think far less problematic for Charlie's argument, I was slightly surprised not to see more discussion of China under Deng Xiaoping and his successors in the book. Now, this is a totally unfair point to make about a book that covers so much of the world so knowledgeably. I mean, these are not, political scientists can't write books like this, and so we snipe only from the sidelines. But surely contemporary China is the ultimate project state, even if its project changed quite dramatically after 1986. And so I wonder whether Charlie agrees with that, and what significance, if any, that observation might have for the argument. In other words, it suggests that in some quarters of the world, at least, the project state is alive and well. Well, then third and finally, as Charlie notes, this is a work of history rather than prediction. We can't know the future. You just reiterated that, Charlie, in your opening remarks. But after some decades of, I'm a political scientist, so I'm far less cautious about such things. So after some decades of neoliberalism, I think we may already be seeing the revival of something like a project state, at least in the terms of the book. And I think that this revival, as I see it, could be inspired by three developments. One is the rise of China, which I've already mentioned. Second is the threat of the populist movements that others have mentioned already. The threat that these populist movements, fueled by economic discontent, will challenge established political parties and indeed turn the state to another set of uses. And I would have said that in East Central Europe, in the cases of Hungary and Poland, for instance, and some other countries as well, we're already seeing that, the revival of a project state. And it may be that the third challenge here is, of course, climate change. And there are ways in which the totally misnamed Inflation Reduction Act of Biden, the Chips and Science Act, these things that are so understandably roiling European policymakers may reflect the return of the project state. So the question is, would these qualify for Charlie? Would these qualify as indicators for the emergence of what the book calls a project state? I'm not sure of the answer myself, but I'd be very interested in hearing Charlie's response to that. So let me close by reiterating how much insight I really think there is in this book. On my reading, this is a book of history written from what I would have called the longue durée, which is to say that it's controversial, it's bold. I think there's a good chance that this is the kind of history that would be written of the 21st century by someone who was writing that history in the year 2100. I guess, Charlie, neither of us are going to find out whether that observation is correct or not. But, you know, the four institutional fields at the heart of the analysis that Sid Tarrow and Harold James already mentioned, each of these fields dominated by their own collective actors, they strike me as the fields that probably will come to be seen as characteristic of our age. And I think in many ways, and again, it's perhaps a little unreasonable for a political scientist to say this. In many respects, I think this book is an innovative kind of history. And although political, quite political, it's not really political history in a traditional sense. And although eminently attuned to the social, it's not social or cultural history exactly. It has a focus on firms as well as governments, which I think is enormously useful here. It has a focus on peoples as well as states, and a focus on incremental as well as a kind of cataclysmic developments. So I think this book offers a new template for how the history of our times can be written. And since I think that, Charlie, I'm sure you're only sorry that the New York Times did not ask me to review this. But I enjoyed the book. Thanks very much for providing it. And Professor Basu, thank you very much for giving me the stimulus to read it sooner rather than later.
Peter, that was very generous. I have to make a general comment here. We are having the Center for European Studies having perhaps its major discussion of this book in India, which says something about our world, interconnected world today, and your initiative. Hold on, my phone is bothering me. Okay. So thanks again to Sivama Basu and his initiative, and I would say I was sort of struck by how, Sivama, this book reached your notice and that world so quickly. Peter's comments, I've learned so much from Peter. his last, and I think I cite him in this. Yes, first of all, about this project state, it caused me two major difficulties. One was, as I said, sort of the moral difficulty of, did I really want to associate the Third Reich or the Stalinist regime with Franklin Roosevelt? Part of that is very personal. I was 6 years old when Roosevelt died, but I could see how it just devastated my mother and the family. This, how could, and I try to come to terms with that, but I do think there are two ways of analyzing political regimes, at least two ways. And one is in terms of with a moral cast and how we evaluate them, but also in terms of the more Machiavellian or value-free norm way of doing it. And so I thought there would be this tension with the project state. But I was aware in fact, I'm married to a political scientist, and she, Ann Sada, and she said to me early on, she said, isn't Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, aren't these project states? And in fact, Peter's correct. They are not just, or they do not arise just as the sort of the tide of change ebbs out, and these regimes are left on the beach. They had a project, and the project was to end, in a sense, the project state. So how does one deal with that paradox? I think I tried to at least refer to it, but I clearly didn't develop it in any sustained way. And I mean, I do refer to China and Deng Xiaoping, but in a paragraph. So yes, the horizon is difficult. At one point, because I do believe in sort of revealed preference as one way we can look at history. I mean, if you ask me at one point I say the project states project really, or the neoliberal states project was quite successful, and that is in the West, that is to raise the level of any income inequality higher than the project state had allowed it. We have this is in a sense its monument. So Peter, I take these comments, and I just don't know how to. I guess I could have allowed, but built in more, and maybe in a conclusion, since I don't really, at the end, my metaphor is the one that Thomas Mann used at the end of Magic Mountain, of his soldier sort of in the midst of all these shells going on and not knowing whether he would live or die. And I guess I feel that I'm trying now in my post-peak career project to think about all the issues that I've faced historiographically over 60 years of reading history, and combine it with sort of the different phases in which I've dealt with them. I mean, classical historiographical issues of agency and structure. When do we say, what is a controversy? How do we resolve it, etc.? So some of this, I hope I have the energy to come back to. Climate, I do mention climate change at the end. This, I mean, we will have to deal with it. It's not enough, though, to deal with it just on the state level. We know this, and we don't know how to deal with this. This is always a collective actor problem. I think migration is another issue that states and interstate. We have to solve these on many levels at once. And so, Peter, I take these as thank you for your generous assessment, and it's valuable. Maybe we can arrange to have this discussion since we're about 50 feet away from each other under normal circumstances. Maybe we can arrange to have it without having to sort of zoom into to India. But I'm grateful to India for having Subhama having allowed us that possibility.
Thank you so much, Professor. Professor James had to leave early, but we have some time still at the moment. We can take some questions from the audiences, and if you would like to have some more suggestions, comments, panelists can definitely put in the discussion period, and also Professor Maier, if you would like to. So, yeah, so I would like to check if there are any hands who would like, anyone would like to.
I'm sorry, I have to go. Thank you very much for inviting me. I look forward to reading the book, and I hope to see you again very soon, Charlie.
Okay,
Congratulations for this book.
Okay, thank you. Ciao.
So,
Sydney has his hand up. Professor Taro.
Yes. Professor Taro, would you like to go ahead?
If it's all right, I'd like to latch on to what my friend and collaborator Peter Hall said, and that is about the status of the concept of the policy state.
Yeah, definitely. Sure.
Pardon me?
You can go ahead. Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So first, a small footnote, Charlie. By the term a peak career book, I didn't mean the end of a career book. At least that was how I interpreted it.
No, it's okay.
I interpreted it as the best rather than the end. And perhaps for a political scientist who hasn't read all of your work, that might be a little pretentious, but really I found it an extraordinary experience to read and to learn from. The second thing I'd like to say, and this is more substantive, is that political scientists are often learning so much from historians. Here's an area where there is a strain of work in political science that I think it might be worth comparing to your work on the project state, and that is a very important book in comparative politics called The Policy State by Karen Oren and Steve Skowronek. Karen at UCLA and Steve at Yale, and formerly of Cornell. When you look at that book, you will realize that there are some similarities between their concept and your concept of the project state, but there are some significant differences. And it might be worthwhile, and who knows, we might do this at CES in Cambridge. If I had more to say about it, I would want to compare their book with your book in terms of the status of the concept of the project state. As I read your book, I read the key term to mean a state that has a project, a central project, whereas Oren and Skowronek are talking about a state that's aimed at making policies in the plural. And it would be worth exploring both those similarities and those differences, because theirs, I think, is the most historically embedded study of the policy state coming from political science. And the other thing I wanted to say was, this resonates very much with one of Peter Hall's comments, and that is undoing the previous phase of the policy state, of the project state in the age of neoliberalism, was itself a project, a significant state project, not simply a bundle of single projects. And I think Peter is absolutely right, and this was true in Latin America as well as in Europe, and that is that engaging in undoing a previous project state takes an awful lot of effort and an awful lot of administrative growth. There's data, for example, on Chile's project state under Pinochet that shows that the size of the Chilean state increased during the period when the Chicago boys were inducing Pinochet to undo the previous project state. So this is just to say, and not to reduce your book to an addendum to political science, not at all. This is just to say that a confrontation between the concept of the project state and Oren and Skoranik's work on policy states might be really very revealing to political scientists, if not to historians.
Well, I will look at it. I had read Skoranik's, I guess, first book on which I liked a great deal, which was very historical, of course. And I think he was at Cornell at that point still.
That was his PhD thesis, right?
Yeah, and that was a very stimulating read. And so I'll check this one. I mean, there policy state. There was, I try in a footnote somewhere in the beginning to separate the different designations for states that have been used as ideal types, and report back after I've read it. But I don't know. I don't know his co-author's work, but I'll look at that. Yeah.
Thanks.
So yeah, we have a hand, and it's from our Professor J. Winter. Yeah. If you yes, sir.
Hi, Jay. It's nice to see you.
Good to see you too. And thank you very much, Sumava, for having been, I think, successful in expanding a space for reflection on recent scholarship that can be sadly lacking given the delay in reviewing books and in critical consideration of them. I think you're providing a very important service. I know that from a number of my students who will certainly benefit when this conversation becomes available on YouTube, which I think it will. Is that right, Sumava? Yes, I think so. So it's a resource. The question I wanted to put, Charlie, is simple, and you won't be surprised about it. I keep thinking about Eli Halevi's lectures almost a century ago in Oxford, the Rhodes Lectures, The Era of Tyrannies, as a kind of reflection of the end of the 19th century. This is where he made his own work. And in his remarks, it was clear that one of the purposes of project states that came out of the First World War was war itself, that violence as a mobilizing industry and tool of domination was what he saw as among the catastrophic building blocks of the 20th century that he found completely distasteful. But I wondered whether you might consider the war in Ukraine as a return to war as the project of the project state, that it has its own mobilizing purposes that we have seen before, indeed in many other instances. There might be parallels in the history of Israel, not that I see them as parallel ideologically, but that the force of war itself as a mobilizing element for the crossing of your four vectors of power is something I wanted to ask you about, whether you saw war itself as a fundamental element in the Ukraine story, and one that unfortunately has terribly alarming implications for the rest of us. So would you see that there's a warfare state, policy state, as part of the story that perhaps we'll need to consider over the next 10 years, whatever the outcome of the Ukraine war? That's the question I put to you.
It's a profound question, and it's a profound problem. And since war is such a constant, and since in fact I start the first chapter of the substance of with war memorials, talking about the Carnegie series as of publications as a monument to World War I. I don't know. I hesitate to say. I mean, there are obviously people who do think of war as a regenerative force. A lot of them wrote in German, actually, but some of them wrote in French, and some in English. And it's whether I don't think anybody who's running a project state, very few people, well, some would, perhaps in fascism, where clearly there is a glorification of war, you could say war is a project, but few. I don't think people would have said a particular war is the goal of it. This look, you're the expert on the culture of war, and it's it's clear in the interwar period there are people, and starting with the First World War, who praise the war as the hygiene of. And so in that sense, yes, it belongs to, there are people and there are states who have projects that include war. It's striking to think of, states which profess peace, who do war, which do war so well, for instance, the United States. So I think, I think war is probably a leitmotif. I should explore more in this. I find it hard to deal with. Schumpeter found it easy. All of that war had, war and empire were atavistic. And the challenge of your question is to say, hey, maybe these aren't atavisms at all. And I'd rather not admit that, but I'll consider it. Okay.
Thank you.
It's a good question.
So we are almost at the end of our session, and so I would like to just ask one question to you, Professor Maier. We discussed about the liberal hegemony, and this had also been this also had came when our panelists, Professor Taro and Professor Hall, were commenting. So there always had been a belief that liberalism often leads to liberal hegemony, and the political theorists and scientists during 90s had often claimed that liberal hegemony can be countered by multipolar world. At the moment, there are many multipolar blocks in our world, like SCO, G20, and there are several others. We are also seeing emergence of bipolarity again, the second Cold War between US and China, but there are still presence of multipolar blocks. But even in these multipolar blocks, we have seen like how even the democratic countries are fearful in condemning the countries with authoritarian regimes who are also present in the blocks, and they think that the points of authoritarianism or war, the present war in Ukraine, or any sort of conflicts in Africa is not their thing to worry about. So how do you think, like, what are your views on this? Like, to what extent the multi-partner world or multipolar world be a weapon to counter liberal hegemony? So if you would like to give some comments, and if Professor Taro and Hall has any other opinions also, they can also definitely highlight, and we can end. Yeah.
Well, first of all, about liberalism, most of the recent and younger people's work on empire has stressed that liberalism is deeply tied up. The liberalism and empire go to, are deeply interwoven in many ways, and which is an important insight of this recent history. What we do with the insight is, we can develop it. So, and yes, every bloc has, the question of alliance politics. Look, we had Henry Kissinger on the telephone with the Chilean general saying, well, do what you have to do, but please do it quickly and unobtrusively. That's a little unfair to him, but, no, alliance politics produces, must muddy the water of any ideal type of bloc. So I don't, that's about all I can say to it. I'd like to stress, let me just say in what I think, and what I've learned from this is, in a sense, what is Peter is, the rise of China. I think this, if I do an epilogue at some future point or a revised edition, I think I'd take account of these. I wouldn't rewrite the book, that would be impossible, but I'd take account of this, the rise of China, the state, the rise of the neoliberal project as a state project and not just as a market project. I think this has come out in these categories. The rise of, I haven't allowed for contentious politics on the ground. The fact that people like, just like the liberal war might be as Jay Winters suggested, a project of the project state. So in a sense, we have regimes, this raises the fundamental issue, Aristotle said we're political men. He didn't say women, but okay, let's today say political men and women. But we're also quarrelsome men and women. And to a certain extent, all our institutions are a way of channeling or sublimating, sometimes channeling this energy. I think of, Freud at the end of World War I had to come to terms with what he saw as the violence as a fundamental fact. And I do think, at this point we get into areas that, in a sense, are more underlying history rather than normal history itself. But anyway, I'm very glad this book raises these issues and has, the discussion shows it does what I think it's wonderful a book can do, and that is make people think about their own fields and what they would add and how they would contribute and how we work together as a scholarly community. And you pulled us all together, so thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Professor. So, Professor Hall and Taro, would you like to add something?
Only a footnote to Professor Winters' very useful indication that war can be a project. My own mentor, Charles Tilley, is
Right.
was not only a student of contentious politics, but of state building. And his most famous aphorism was that war made the state and states make war. He was much better at tracing the ways in which early modern European states were built out of war and the need to support war. He was much better at that than at the second part of his aphorism, that is, do states make war because war made the state, or was he just simply adding that on for a rhetorical flourish? He never really did continue the debate about whether states built on war making are warlike as a result. I don't know what he would have said. He passed away in 2008, but it makes me wonder if war as a project is, in some sense, the long-term macrostructural outcome of states that are built on the functions of war making. That would be something that I'd love to talk with both Professor Winter and Charlie about if this dialogue continues. But I would like to thank you, Sumava, and the rest of you for inviting me. I have to unfortunately go out to the dentist, after which I will become less verbose for a long time. And I enjoyed this very, very much. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, professors. It was great having you. And Professor Maier and I always discussed on the issue of China, and Professor Maier is deeply interested in the modern Cold War, and we had a couple of discussions, and he also suggested we should do some events. Probably Professor Maier should write a book on this global geopolitics, modern day between US and China. It would be really great, actually. Please do consider, Professor.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you so much.
If I can get beyond letters of recommendation, I will do that.
Thank you so much, Professor,
Right,
and
okay.
Professor Stado, Professor Hall, and also Professor James for
It's
joining.
wonderful seeing all old friends again. This
Yeah,
is
it
great.
was indeed a
Okay.
great event. And
Okay,
we wish
thanks
you
again.
best for your book. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Okay.